Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Patrice Johnson, the very proud Vice President for the Center for Policy and Housing Research and the Leadership Institute. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for a very important conversation, the first session of the Emerging Leaders Summit, which will feature today's conversation on student loan debt and its barrier to building Black wealth. The reason we started the series is simple: to provide critical policy updates on the most pressing issues facing the Black community. It's from this foundation that we launched our first ever Emerging Leaders Summit, and we're very excited about it. So today we will hear from Millennial and Gen Z voices as we examine two topics that affect building Black wealth and entrepreneurship. This morning's session, again, is student loan debt, a barrier to building Black wealth. We will critically examine some important questions surrounding student loan debt. For example, what are the future implications of taking out debt, and in what ways can we eliminate this barrier to building wealth for our community? And while these are important questions for millennials and Gen Zers, we also will explore what implication the issue holds across the Black community now and into the future. Most importantly, how do we move forward given the immense challenges? This panel, who we will hear from momentarily, includes finance and policy experts with the expertise and insight to guide us through the conversation. So I am thrilled that they have chosen to join us today. The fellow from CBCF, who is going to help steward this conversation, is none other than one of our amazing social justice fellows. This young lady is truly amazing. She's unafraid to discuss this issue, Ms. Shanae Chase. So let me give you a brief overview of who this young lady is. Shanae is a social worker at heart who is keenly focused on how racism is embedded into the policies of public and private institutions, and how institutions can transition from causing harm to eradicating the causes of harm. Her diverse clinical experience includes working in constituent services for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and providing academic counseling to undergraduate students of color at Boston College. In her social work practice, she works at the intersection of racial wealth disparities and racial health disparities. So most recently, she worked as a financial counselor in Roxbury, Massachusetts, but she currently serves as our a social justice fellow working in Rep. Priestley's office. Please help me to welcome Janae Chase.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I am so excited to be here today, so excited to be a social justice fellow as well, and have this incredibly important topic. It definitely is a topic du jour, but we know it's not just a hot topic to talk about. It's also something that has such a significant impact on the livelihood of our communities. So I'm really excited to talk policy, to talk solutions, and to talk about how we got here. So we have a terrific panel of brilliant scholars today. First, we have Victoria Lee, who is a PhD student at Harvard University, focusing on education policy and program evaluation. We also are joined by Dr. Fenaba Ado, who is an associate professor of public policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we have Dr. Devon Graves, who is an assistant professor of higher education at California State University at Stanislaus. So excited to be here with you all. Let's get into it. For generations, the drumbeat for Black communities and Black families has been go to college. That is your ticket out of wherever those experiences you've been from. That is how you can break cycles of generational poverty. And because of that, we know that families and communities make these incredible sacrifices to send students to college. But unfortunately, for far too many students, that investment in higher education is being undermined by these insurmountable sums of student debt. So, Ms. Lee, I'd love to start with you. Can you kick us off and provide an overview of how we got here? And what are some of the key factors that have contributed to a student debt crisis, particularly for Black borrowers?
Absolutely. First, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As far as how we got to the current debt situation that we are in right now, I think there's a few phenomenon that have happened in the past 50 to 60 years that have culminated to the situation we are in now, which is one that's particularly acute for Black student borrowers. Specifically, the federal aid programs that we have now are based on the 1965 Higher Ed Act. However, the original program was a grant-based program. And in the past 60 years or so, it has shifted to one that is more heavily reliant on loans. So this has created a situation where students are taking out more loans. At the same time, there's been a disinvestment from state legislatures into higher ed. So where we had a public investment, now students are charged with carrying a larger burden of debt, and the aid that they have is no longer primarily grant-based aid. There's more loan-based aid. This is, of course, particularly problematic for Black student borrowers because a host of policies, including discriminatory lending policies, redlining, has created a situation where we have a racial wealth gap, which makes it harder for Black student borrowers to shoulder this burden that they are required to do so. That's the broad picture. I also think there's a more recent trend that is really worth noting. In the past few decades, we've seen a rise in enrollment in for-profit colleges, and these colleges charge higher tuition for similar programs as community colleges, and they often provide educations that don't allow students to get jobs that allow them to pay back the loans they take out. And these programs are disproportionately enrolling Black students. So we have Black students defaulting on even small loan amounts or relatively small loan amounts from these for-profit colleges and universities. And I think that is a really important piece of the larger picture over the past several decades.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that framing. And we'll get into some of the details here, but I think that sets us up really nicely to have this conversation. Dr. Graves, I'll turn to you. And as Ms. Lee mentioned, this is not just an issue at classic, our cornerstone four-year institutions. I'd love for you to share a little bit about how the student debt crisis is impacting students in community college in maybe two-year programs, and if you can share some insights into their student loan and financial aid experiences.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this panel. Let's contextualize community colleges first, because there's this misconception that community colleges are the affordable colleges. But in fact, we know that the community colleges serve a high population of low-income students, first-generation students, minoritized students, and African-American students primarily get their start in the community colleges. So our focus on the community college context is so important here. The financial aid experiences matter for our students in the community colleges, because for far too long, research has focused on those cornerstone institutions that you shared, Shanae, that we've been only focusing on those students attending four-year universities. But a body of literature and research is growing that highlights a burdensome process that community college students have to go through in order to receive their aid. And even in my specific area of research, when I look at the front end of the financial aid process about how students receive their aid, we see that examples like income verification becoming a difficult process for students to receive the aid that they need in order to access their higher education. But similar to what Ms. Lee shared, the research about student loan debt in the community college tells us some troubling stories. As Ms. Lee said, the rise of predatory lending and for-profit two-year colleges disproportionately impacted Black borrowers. And the default rate for borrowers who did not complete a degree or program of study is higher than those who did complete a degree or program of study. And this is a huge problem in community colleges where degree completion or the lack of degree completion is prevalent. So these areas are important to focus on in the community college context is important to highlight.
Thank you. And, we really need to focus on, the whole spectrum of the educational experience and how at every access point, so many students, particularly Black students, are facing these burdens, and we're lacking these truly affordable options. Dr. Ado, can you put a finer point for us on how the student debt crisis is an extension of historic racial inequality in our nation, and why are our Black students and Black and brown students carrying such a massive student loan burden?
Yes, thank you for having me. It's great to be here this morning. So I'll just start where actually Ms. Lee already started. I'll continue where Ms. Lee started, and drawing this connection between racial wealth inequality and student debt accumulation. And actually, I can even, and later, we get into it later, talk about student debt contributing to ongoing racial wealth inequality. But what we see is that, we have historical legacies of racial discrimination that have exploited and taken wealth from Black communities and Black families over time. Historically, racist policies that have created situations in which Black families and households have not been able to accumulate the same amount of wealth as white households. And every generation have had to rebuild or start again, right? And so when we look at national data sets of wealth inequality, Black families have about 1/10 of the wealth of white households, and these numbers just kind of persist over time. They don't change, and they actually grew a little bit during the Great Recession. So what this means is that parents who are sending their children to college have had very fewer resources to pull from in order to support and help their children pay for college. And this relationship means that they have to turn to credit markets, which are predatory, and have large restrictions on access to credit. And so we see lots of parents and children taking on or turning to loans in order to pay for their education and taking on more debt to do so. One of the things that we found in some of our research was that even at the higher ends of the Black wealth distribution, we know that even being at the higher end of the Black wealth distribution doesn't mean having significant wealth, that those children from those families actually took on a lot more debt than children from the lower ends of the wealth distribution. And we attribute this to vast differences in home equity, being able to pull money from one's home in order to help and assist with paying for college, much fewer like liquid savings or access to financial assets assets that are much more fungible and can assist children in paying for these paying for these educations. So there is, I like to say, a direct line in between historical legacies of racial wealth inequality within our society, and specifically Black-white wealth inequality, and the high rates of debt accumulation that we are seeing among recent cohorts of young adults within our society, especially Black students.
Absolutely. And, we see the direct connection between redlining and these outright racist attempts to undermine Black wealth. And, this assumption that if you get a better education, get a better job, you'll be able to buy a house. But we know that these bedrock systemic racial issues are, poisoning that opportunity for Black communities. So thank you so much for really laying that out for us. I've noticed in the Q&A, folks are also bringing up graduate student debt as well. And as we talk about community college and four-year institutions, we know this is not just for undergraduate students. We know, and as we've got a bunch of doctors in the room, so folks who have pursued the highest of education. So I think this is a room that absolutely understands the additional burdens of trying to attain higher education as well. So we'll continue to fold that into our conversation, but I want to pivot to what we're really talking about now, cancellation. And, many borrowers have been heartened by the posture of members of Congress and the president towards student debt cancellation. And I've heard people I know say that they don't want to make payments, or they're not planning on making payments after certain pauses end, because they believe that some sort of relief is on the way. So why pay if it's going to get canceled anyway? I pose this to all our panelists, and maybe we can just do a quick round robin, but what do you tell borrowers who are hanging on to this hope as payment and interest pauses come to an end? We can start with you, Dr. Graves.
Oh, I was nervous to start on this one, but my thoughts are we have to remain practical. If you can afford to make an on-time payment towards your loan debt, make it. As much as I want to hold out hope that something's going to happen, we've been down roads before where we think something's coming, but if you can make that payment, make the payment and hope for the best, but be ready for much not needed defeat if it doesn't happen.
I guess I also add that we also know that defaulting on one's loan or non-payment are tied to short-term and long-term credit credit consequences. And so I would not want to encourage people to take actions that could negatively affect their ability to borrow or pay more for borrowing in the future, until we have those systems in place that can really support and protect them from making those kind of actions. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna echo what Drs. Graves and Ado said. I think the consequences of not making payments are far-reaching, and even though the administration has signaled that they want to do this, there's no certain path to that. So I think, making on-time payments is really important as far as like purchasing homes and things that will actually help us build wealth as Black people. Making on-time payments is really critical.
Absolutely. Each of you reiterated how important it is to make on-time payments, but for those borrowers that really can't, and income-based repayment isn't working for them, or those resources just aren't available and still cannot make monthly payments, what are resources, or what advice would you give those borrowers who feel completely underwater and are facing choices between rent and groceries and making a student loan payment? Of course, in the pandemic, we know there were some pauses, but for folks who have private loans, who were not eligible for those pauses, or folks who are looking down the tunnel at what happens post-pandemic, what advice would you give them?
So I'll kick it off. My advice is, first talk to your loan servicer, see what resources are there for you, check there first. For those who are struggling, go to your loan servicer first. And then in all that free time that you have out there researching student loans, understand the loan forgiveness programs, make sure you ask the questions that you need to ask in order for when you go up for forgiveness that it happens, because you hear stories of folks who go up, think they're ready, and then there's an issue and it doesn't happen. So just ask those questions and do your research.
I agree with Dr. Graves. I'll just add, in addition to that, I think it's really important that borrowers tell their stories. Tell like you have referenced people who have to juggle or make decisions around which bills to prioritize in this moment, and why they may be defaulting is because they have to prioritize the housing, the food, you know, these other major decisions that are helping them sustain themselves during these very tight moments. And luckily we have avenues that, you know, we can hear these stories through social media, you know, through blog posts, and it may sound a little trite, but I think that these stories help policymakers and help researchers add to the numbers that we're seeing, and help us explain the mechanisms that are contributing to the outcomes that we see, particularly within our community, particularly within Black communities, because we know that it's not just the student debt crisis that we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with the labor market crisis. We're dealing with a health disparities crisis. We're dealing with, you know, so many other housing crises right now as well. And so I think that telling the stories helps paint the broader picture of our economic, of our economic state of our communities, and that's very important.
Absolutely. Ms. Lee, do you have anything you wanted to add to that? I know that it's a tough question, and it's obviously there's no simple answer.
Yeah, just one other like specific avenue that can be taken that I'd like to highlight is for federal loans, there's you can apply for economic hardship or unemployment deferment, and information on that is studentaid.gov. And this allows you to have zero interest and defer your payments based on your economic situation.
Well,
I'll just add one more thing. I think, to Ms. Lee's point, I think it is hard because I think, a lot of folks, most people hold federal loans, but a lot of us also hold private loans. And unfortunately, they don't offer the same protections that the federal loans offer, that are trying to offer. And so people who have private loans, unfortunately, when they talk to their loan servicers, are not usually offered a lot of options. And they are much more rigorous about going about and getting the money or penalizing borrowers from that. So, we're talking specifically about the repayment piece in this part, but, we have to definitely talk, when we open up this discussion to the accumulation piece and the avenues not to take or to try to, decrease the likelihood that people turn to the private market because those loans just offer less protections in moments like this.
Absolutely. Well, I really want to focus a little bit more on this conversation and also in the context of policy solutions, because obviously, as you mentioned, Dr. Ado, we are experiencing multi-layered, complex crises that extend far beyond the pandemic, and that the pandemic has only exacerbated. And student loan debt has severe financial and mental health consequences that only compound onto other communal and interpersonal trauma that our community has experienced over the past year and over generations. So let's focus on policy and maybe find some bright spots here if possible. Ms. Lee, you talked about some benefits, some repayment options and forgiveness programs. But we also know that a lot of eligible borrowers are not reaping those benefits. And we've heard these stories too about folks who thought everything was lined up and they got to their 10-year period and were ready for their loans to be forgiven. And they found out at the 11th hour that they're not actually eligible for that forgiveness. How can we lower those obstacles? How can we reform, if possible, some of those options so we can address those obstacles and lighten the student loan burden for all, and to make sure folks who are eligible actually are able to reap the benefits of those types of programs?
Absolutely. I think one major improvement we could make to our federal aid programs is simplifying them. I think right now there's several income-based repayment programs that students can select in addition to the standard 10-year plans. And there's a huge, it takes a huge barrier for students to understand the different plans, the implications for them. And so if I were a policymaker, I would be really working quite hard to make one income-based repayment plan that students are automatically enrolled in. And that would help students at the outset when they're considering their college options, understand what it's going to cost them, how long they will be repaying it, and fully understand the breadth of options they have.
Yeah, I think that is so spot on, is that education piece and really knowing at the outset what you're getting yourself into, so you can also understand the full suite of your options, and also those automatic leverage points are so important, because forcing students to find out all this information on their own only compounds the stress and the mental health aspect of this crisis. Dr. Graves, you know, a lot of folks are in the chat talking about their private loans as well. And as Dr. Ado mentioned, you know, a lot of this conversation is moot when it comes to private loans. So maybe focusing on the other side of this, and the other big player here, is student aid the answer? You know, do schools just need to leverage their endowments and other funding sources to administer more aid to students? Share what higher education institutions of all sizes and 4 years or 2 years or whatever can do to contribute in this conversation.
Yes, this is a great question. And financial aid, you know, student aid is not necessarily the only answer, but it is an important factor in the equation. So an example is reforming the Pell Grant. So extending the years of eligibility. We know that the 4-year university may be a myth now, that we need to look at 5 years or 6 years. Usage in the summer, you know, Pell Grant is a perfect example of something that needs to be reformed that can support many low income and those on the lower end of the middle income to help support their educational cost. When it comes to university endowments, these things are tricky. On one hand, you have colleges and universities that do utilize endowments for some types of institutional aid. But when it comes to these endowments, most private donors that give money to these endowments, they don't want to make up cost that the state or the federal government used to supply for. So endowments aren't necessarily the only answer, because it's private dollars donated to the institution, sometimes public dollars as well. But if you have a private individual donor giving to an endowment, they get to say where they want those dollars to go. But when it comes to our higher education institutions, what they need to provide in this conversation is two things. They need transparency on cost. So it seems every year our institutions are raising cost. We need to understand why those costs are raising, and it needs to be transparent and accessible information. And then our institutions need to be innovative. What are institutions doing to lessen the cost? What cost sharing agreements are taking shape? I know in California, the universities have a procurement partnership. So when they place orders, it helps to lessen costs. We need to understand how we're leveraging buildings and ground spaces, how universities and colleges can utilize these spaces together to help lessen cost. And those are just a couple examples that our institutions should be thinking about and should be doing.
Thank you, because, you know, as much as we can talk about reforming the loan situation and talk about, you know, what students are leaving with, we really need to think about the totality of the investment and what are students actually investing in. Is it their education, or is it capital projects at universities and those types of things? So very much have to bring higher education institutions into this conversation. They are not off the hook at all. And that's really the root of why students are, you know, one of the many root causes of the crisis is that education is so incredibly expensive. Of course, as we mentioned before, we talked a little bit about student debt cancellation, and, you know, we have to have this conversation because it is top of mind, and we hear rumors all over the hill that, you know, something's coming, that, you know, the administration might make a statement, perhaps Department of Ed will issue something about authority here. So let's just get into this a little bit more. And I'd love to answer some or ask some more questions from the chat. So please put your questions in the Q&A feature as well, so we can work them into the conversation. But Dr. Ado, let's get into this highly discussed policy solution. Can you walk us through what student debt cancellation could look like? And also, could you talk a little bit about, before I see that we've been joined by the congressman, so we can also yield time to him, but that is where I would love to kick it to you, Dr. Doe, about what student debt cancellation could look like from the executive branch and the legislative branch.
We're ready to continue now? And so, okay, yes. So yeah, when we think about student debt cancellation, there's been a lot of push by quite a few current senators and policy advocates on the executive order of President Biden using an executive order. The other avenue being it going through Congress. After speaking with lots of legal experts, the reason why there's such a push for the executive order is because Congress is hindered by the costs. They would be focused on the cost of the program. And so the driving that would be the inability of them to actually extend, possibly due to their cost constraints, not help as many people under the who are as many debtors or as many people who have outstanding debts, and then picking and choosing who then would be eligible under the criteria of their program. It just would also be potentially a slower process if it went under Congress. One of my good colleagues likes to say that we would like Congress to focus on some of those debt-free college initiatives and instead leave the student debt cancellation issue to the executive branch. I should also mention that we have also had some, recently due to the COVID-19 crisis, some evidence that this can be done, right? So under the former Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, acted on stopping the payments prior to President Trump, and under the CARES Act, it actually going into effect, and then former President Trump also extending the moratorium on student debt payments longer. So one could say that those were laying the groundwork for a potential debt cancellation program. And so we don't need a precedent. We already had a precedent of student debt cancellation actually happening, and it happening through the executive and through actions of our elected officials already, and our appointed officials already. So there's a much more complexity behind this, but I think the idea being here that we want to reach the most number of borrowers that have not just the small debts, who there are a lot of them, but we know Black borrowers are disproportionately represented in those who have a lot of the debts. If there is constraints on the amount so that they could actually a number of borrowers that could actually receive debt cancellation, then we would want something that happened directly and under a program that would not be constrained by cost.
Well, I'm going to just chime in and kind of break up the fun for a moment and introduce one of our congressmen who is truly a servant leader and working on behalf of us to deal with some of these issues. So let me introduce Congressman Gregory Meeks from the great state of New York. The congressman chairs the House of Foreign Affairs Committee, the first African-American member to do so. He's also a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, where he serves as the, chairman of the subcommittee on consumer protection and financial institutions. This experience and more make his thoughts and his insight for today truly a voice that we need to hear to understand the complexities of student loan debt. So I thank you so much, Congressman Meeks, for joining us, and I will yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Patrice. Thank you so much. And of course, I want to thank the Congressional Black Caucus's foundation and its presidents, Ms. Veazey, and everyone all of our panelists and everyone that's on and listening, especially our emerging leaders who is they're not, sometimes you say they're the future, but I'm sure those that are on this, they are the present. And talking about early on, dealing with student loan debt, which prohibits us oftentimes from creating the wealth that we need to create, is something that we have to talk about. It's something that I know that we have to deal with here in Washington, D.C. And as Ms. Addo has said, it's complicated because of the complexities within the Congress itself and trying to get, as many of you have seen, the 60 votes that's necessary to get a bill through the Senate and not having the wherewithal to do that on some of what I think are the basic things further complicates the issue legislatively here. And so if we could pass it in the House, and we can pass several bills right now in the House, even though we've got just a 4-vote majority. But the deal is, can we get it through the Senate, and then can we get it through and get it to the president's desk? So executive order is a methodology of which we could utilize in dealing with the administration. And I think that's a good thing. And I'll get back to that in 1 second. We all have suffered. I can recall back even when I was a youngster, the problem that I had graduating Howard Law School was student loans, student debt. That immediately meant I had an uneven playing field. So number one, we know that in general, Black and brown people, there's a wage discrepancy. So most places you start off with that discrepancy. And then you add student loans, student debt on top of that. And that's even if the salaries were level, they're not, because most of the other counterparts, they are making more money because they don't have the student debt that most Black and brown kids have. And so when you go to try to either save money so that you can invest in a home, which is a great creator of wealth, or just paying your rent, or just trying to get a car or something of that nature, you're already at a deficit compared to your recent grad, because you have less income, less net income than they do. And then as a result, and trying to keep up and trying to have a place to live and, and trying to make sure that you have transportation to get to and from work, et cetera, often and far too often, we find that it is people who are Black and brown who then fall into repair as far as their credit is concerned. And we know how important credit is, so they either pay late or don't pay at all because they have to make choices as to whether or not they are going to pay their student debt, or they're going to pay their rent, or they're going to pay for their utilities, or they're going to pay for food. So this is something that we have been focused on, particularly here at the Congressional Black Caucus, to try to make sure that we figure out ways, even here on a legislative point of view, to deal with this. So just last week, for example, I introduced a bill that put forth a policy that immediately we were fortunate, and this is why politics again is important, because a former Congressional Black Caucus member, a former mayor, Marcia Fudge, is now the secretary for HUD. So I put forth a bill, I introduced a bill that put forth a policy that the Federal Housing Authority quickly adapted to reform the loan mortgage formula for student loan borrowers. So the past rule was overly restrictive and amounted to a student debt penalty that unfairly closed the door to wealth building for many home-ready Americans. And I'm one that says and urge individuals to buy a home. In fact, we use the philosophy, you want to own the home and rent the car. Why is that? Because if you do that, a home is an appreciating asset and a car is a depreciating asset. So we want to tell all of our young folks to keep in mind that that is the formula that you want to utilize. But again, because of the way the scenario was set up and how your credit rate was looked at because of your student loan, it was overly restrictive and amounted to a penalty that prevented you from being ready to open that door to home ownership. So now the FHA will consider potential home buyers' student debt obligations based on what they actually pay monthly, which will assist, it was estimated approximately 50% of federal student loan borrowers and income-driven repayment plans with securing an FHA loan for a house. So, so it's trying to think out of the box. And I think that many of you are going to be the ones that help us think out of the box, quite frankly, so that we can have reformative policies like these that will help, help you create generational wealth and build back better from the pandemic, which has also have caused problems for many of you as we move forward. So we've got to continue to advocate for reformative policies that address student loan debt, and so that it will not become a barrier to building wealth. Now, this is something that's tremendously important, and most of you I know talk about, because when we think about how do we move ahead, it is with a combination of legislative policies that may reform what's currently in place. Is agitating in the executive branches of government to make sure that they happen. And this is how and why elections have consequences, because but for Marcia Fudge being the Secretary of HUD, this little piece would not have been there, because this is something that we actually have been advocating for with the private administration that walked on deaf ears. This is really, really important. So now I'm one that don't jump for joy just for one little piece, but I do recognize that one little piece, which was very important. So I'm particularly pleased with the FHA's decision, but we all know that the work doesn't stop here, just doesn't stop here. So there's many solutions that we need to do to address the barriers of student loan. Look, we're about to get through the COVID-19 pandemic, but we know that there were some pre-existing factors, and student loan was one even before COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 may have exacerbated that problem that already exists, but now we've got to focus on it. And I end with this, which I think is, that you should know, and that the Congressional Black Caucus, for example, we are all focused on it. We are part of, for the first time, we got a number of members on the Financial Services Committee. And that is significant because we all come from a similar background than many of you. We've all gone through many of the struggles that you're going through right now. And so we are, and so therefore we know we need to engage with you, but come up with some creative ideas that is really going to resolve some systemic issues that we've had in our systems that negatively impacted the ability of people of color, Black and brown particularly, of accumulating wealth and leveling the playing field with wealth. And we've got to be focused on that. And so I look forward to continuing to push and hearing your ideas and your thoughts. You've got some expert panelists that are right here. And I was listening to a couple before I even put my camera on. My staff was listening. And I want to thank them for their expertise that they bring to this, because truth of the matter is, a lot of times, those of us who are members of Congress, we depend on your panelists to come with these ideas that we can then translate into legislative action to make a difference. So I'll stop there. Thank you all for participating. Thank the panelists for being here. And I look forward to making tomorrow better than today or yesterday. Thank you all, and enjoy your sessions.
Thank you so much, Congressman Meeks. I was in the chat and I said, man, he's preaching right now. So I appreciate your remarks, and I appreciate your effort in developing this new policy. Janae, I will gladly turn it back over to you and our panelists to wrap up some final questions.
Take care.
Absolutely. What a wonderful interjection to this conversation. Thank you so much, Congressman. I think that really energized so much of us, and also put such a finer point on the things we've been talking about this morning about where the federal government can operate in this, and also so much of the other systemic issues and the other barriers in intersecting solutions that we need to focus on to really address this crisis. So to pick up a little bit where we left off, and I think some of the things that the Congressman was just speaking to is our conversation about cancellation. Ms. Lee, I'd love to continue with you. So if we lived in a world where we had all the votes necessary and everyone agreed on cancellation as a viable option. Very much a little bit of a fantasy, but work with me a little bit. If we lived in this world, how would we determine how much should actually be canceled and who qualifies, and how would we ensure that equity is centered in a cancellation policy and making sure that cancellation actually impacts those most affected by debt?
Absolutely. Even though we're talking in a theoretical world, I'm gonna have my answer sort of reflect what Congressman Meeks said about the challenges of getting some of this legislation through. As far as like how much debt should be canceled, my personal opinion is that a number around 10K would address, would forgive the large proportion of debt for our most vulnerable students, those students who are in community college programs. And those students have lower earning potential. And so I think canceling the vast majority of their debt should be prioritized. I also think there's other populations that absolutely need debt forgiveness. Those who have student borrowers who have gone to programs that were fraudulent and predatory, their debt needs to be forgiven and should have already been done. So I think there's also another population that we can think about, which are parent borrowers. There's a significant number of parent borrowers who have plus loans, who are even living below the poverty line, who have taken out loans that they will never be able to pay back. Those loans should not have been made. Students should have been given grant aid to pursue their education, and those debts that those parents have taken out to give their children a better chance, I think should absolutely be forgiven.
Thank you for that. It's such a difficult question, and we know there's so many folks who have large student debt burden that attended programs that are now defunct, that because of where they went, they're actually not able to get a job because of the value of their degree. And thank you for bringing parents into this conversation as well, because we know this isn't just students. And at the top, I alluded to how communities are really making sacrifices. It's not just individuals who are carrying this burden. We know that communities and families, and there is intergenerational debt that is carried even just with sending one student to college. So thank you for bringing those things into the conversation. Dr. Graves, another question here on cancellation before we just pivot to some final questions. Is one-time sweeping cancellation actually going to bring sustainable change? Is this really worth it to pursue, especially for students who miss out on cancellation, who are still in school right now with nearing hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt? Do they just have to wait for the crisis to peak again for another cancellation, or how do we actually bring about sustainable change, and how do we follow up a potential cancellation?
Definitely, relief now will bring change for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of borrowers. There's no doubt that it will cause an injection into the economy where students have been putting, or borrowers have been putting money towards loan payments or struggling, now have dollars to place elsewhere, and everyone benefits from that. But the hope for relief for those in the now, that relief comes with reforms for the future so that it combats this crisis from ever happening again. And the reforms have to center on answering one primary question: how much is higher education a priority for our country? What levels of financial aid support and reform would the United States Department of Education engage with? Examples being increasing the Pell Grant, reforming federal loan forgiveness programs that has been mentioned before, and other aspects of the financial aid process that need to be simplified. And then what is funding support expectations for state and individual higher education institutions? The states defer on levels of support for state aid and types of aid programs that they offer in their states. And the same goes for institutions of higher learning. So there needs to be a clear agreement in place between all entities, the federal government, state governments, and higher education institutions to make sure that there's a clear commitment moving forward for our future students who will need to borrow in order to obtain a higher education.
Right. We can't just have a one and done cancellation and hope everything's going to be peaches after that. We need to have those conversations and engage at all levels of policymaking, including those higher education institutions, to figure out, if we are able to get to cancellation, whatever that number is, we have to figure out a plan to move forward. One time won't be enough for so many students and so many parents and communities. On this point as well, I've seen this so much in the chat and kind of building off some things that Congressman Meeks had said, how do we really build wealth even after, taking on these student debt burdens? Lots of folks are talking about, I went to graduate school, and as I shared before, this is a room full of folks who have gone to graduate school, and we're told that's your ticket to your higher salary. That'll be your ticket into a place where you can actually be able to pay back your loans. Is that true? Sometimes it doesn't feel so true. And I posit this to all of the panelists, and we can go around quickly. This also incentivizes Black and Brown students to leave the communities they're from to go work in places where they can make money back faster. And so we're losing a lot of folks who reflect the community, and from hospitals, from community health centers. I'm a social worker by trade, and I have a master's in social work, and I know so many folks who are, my Black peers have left communities because they want to go work in private practice, or they want to work in spaces where they know they'll be able to build wealth for themselves and build for their family. So what do we make of that, and how do we pursue higher education, but also center our communities and center the good work that so many of us want to do? Dr. Adele, let's start with you.
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces to that question, so I'm trying to figure out what to tackle first. So some thoughts. One thing I will think about, I'll talk about when we talk about wealth generation, is that a lot of wealth is inherited, right? So that's why we have to think about larger and broader and historical context of wealth inequality within our society. And we just don't have the rates of inherited wealth within our community. And in fact, we have higher rates of downward mobility. I also want to point out too that I think that when we think about wealth, we tend to think of, even as, I was trained to think about it as an individual level or household level resource, but we come from traditions in which we think about the community and wealth as within our community, and how wealth has been extracted or exploited from our community, not just at the individual and household level, but at a more larger unit. And so I think that having that framing can help us to think about solutions and be innovative, like the Representative Meeks said, with regard to solutions, and really pushing towards policy-based solutions in particular. We can think, at a very basic level, if we're thinking about closing the racial wealth gap, something like reparations or baby bonds and those type of initiatives. But also if you want to move more down to the unit and the individual, how do we think about wealth generation for the household, and such as debt cancellation, reducing debt, and investing in assets and investments that are going to increase and improve that. But I think it's really, really, really difficult within our current structures, within our society, to generate the type, because Black communities, we just don't have a lot of wealth. We're about 13% of the population. We have about 3% of the total wealth in this country. So it's just really, really difficult, to have this massive amount of wealth generation. But I will also say, not to end on such a down note, but I also think that pursuing higher education and going to school and getting graduate degrees is actually, for now, what we know is delaying. It's the timing issue. So it's pushing back these markers of achieving these assets. It's not that it's never going to happen. It's just, we see that it's just not happening at the same time as white Americans or white counterparts. And because of that timing delay, it's reducing the growth in that in that wealth accumulation. So, we are doing it. We're getting our degrees, we're getting the houses, but it's maybe a little, not at 30, it's not at 35, it's at 40, it's at 45. And that has implications for retirement savings, intergenerational wealth, and inheritances as well.
Absolutely. We have about 1 minute left. So, a tough question, and love to keep this conversation going for hours. But lastly, I'll just end on one final question, which will maybe leave us with a little bit of positivity. If all the panelists could share in one sentence, making it really tough for you, what do you think is the most impactful and most readily available, policy solution to at least lessen the student burden, for Black borrowers in just a sentence? Dr. Graves, we'll start with you.
Improving the forgiveness programs, how you apply for forgiveness, how you certify for forgiveness every year, that should be an easy change, and it needs to happen.
Ms. Lee.
I'm going to jump off what Dr. Graves said earlier in the conversation. I think reforms to the Pell Grant could be transformational for the highest needs students. Increasing the maximum Pell Grant and making it available for longer periods of time could really help students in lowering their loan balances.
And bring us home, Dr. Ado.
I'll say also reforming in addition to all those great suggestions, and we need to also reform income-driven repayment systems for it currently. Yeah, so absolutely. We have systems in place, they just need to be improved upon with an equity lens.
Absolutely. Yes. And with an equity lens, for sure. I think that's a great place for us to conclude this conversation. Thank you all. This was so great. I know I personally left with a lot of good ideas I want to look into, and for the emerging leaders among us, I hope you all took some really great ideas out of this and how you can leverage your leadership and the role you have in your communities and in your workplace to really make a difference here and help us change and help us build Black wealth in our communities, and while also pursuing education and getting those degrees.
Thank you so much. What an amazing panel. I am kind of over here cheering you guys on. Thank you so much for your insight. Thank you for your scholarship and acknowledging, especially that these issues need to be considered via an equity lens. So on that note, again, thank you for joining us. I would be just remiss for not acknowledging Congressman Meeks for stopping in and sharing his thoughts with us and the work that he is doing to help reform issues around student loan debt. Thank you all for our guests and our panelists. And also those of you who joined us for this conversation, who have asked really interesting questions. Thank you for joining us today. So I will say I do have some closing items to share with this community. One, feel free to join us again this afternoon at 2 o'clock for a really another awesome discussion on entrepreneurship, a mission-driven entrepreneurship. That panel will be moderated by Breakfast Club host Angela Yee and features 3 African-American entrepreneurs who we believe are mission-driven and can share their stories with us. In addition to that, if you have not already, feel free to join us at 7 o'clock for our scholarship celebration. It is going to be something that you do not want to miss. If you have an opportunity, log on to cbcf.org and register. It's not too late, but we've got the clock this evening where we will be starting. And then finally, we appreciate your feedback. If by any means you have the QR code when we end, just go ahead and let us know what your thoughts were so that we can adjust and be sure that we are serving the community appropriately. And then finally, if you're not following us on Twitter or LinkedIn or Instagram, you are missing out. Feel free to make sure you are following us. Thank you all again for joining us. Have an amazing day.